The focus today, the President's second day at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Let's take you to Braamfontein now, where we find my colleague Michelle Craig and our politics editor Sbu Ngalwa, and they do have Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo along with them. Sbu, as we listen to the President giving evidence today, many a time he would refrain from actually answering the question that was asked of him, but would retort to saying that the ANC is going through a state of renewal. The ANC is going through a cleansing state. But also when asked why it is that he gave positions to Arthur Fraser as well as David Mahlobo, despite the allegations against them, how did he respond to that? Any sort of responsibility from the current government regarding the state of the country right now and the reappointment of those with allegations into senior positions in cabinet and senior positions in the country?
I guess, Tammy, those kind of responses by the President, obviously, it's to cover himself, if I may say that, because the crucial questions around what he did and what he did not do and what he knew still stand. And if you listened actually to what the evidence leader, Advocate Pretorius, was asking him when he says to the President that in your position as the Deputy President, you feared being fired, and being fired by who? And at that time he says that being fired by the President, Jacob Zuma at the time. But I don't think the Commission was convinced by that response, hence that follow-up question by the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo saying that you may have been fired, you could be fired from the presidency of the country in your position as Deputy President of the country, but you still held a powerful position within the ANC, which pretty much says that, in that position he would not have been in a position to be fired by former President Jacob Zuma without the ANC being involved. And I guess, Tammy, that also brings us to exactly this discussion that we will be having here with my colleague Michelle Craig and Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo of the University of Johannesburg. Maybe let's start, Michelle, with Professor Kondlo here. Prof, is it good enough, though, for the President to say, I did not act because I feared that I could be fired? Is it a reasonable answer for him to give? I think, Prof, you do not have your mic in hand.
Well, Sbu, I would argue that given the President's understanding of balance of power within the ANC at that time, not only within the ANC but also outside the ANC, because as a leader we respect your leadership when you can read the signs of time. Had he acted at that point, he would not have been back to the ANC as president and back to the ANC with this kind of project, trying to clean the mess which happened during state.
But I would argue, though, Prof, that Jacob Zuma was fired as Deputy President of the country and remained Deputy President of the ANC and went on to win a conference.
But let us talk about, let's look into the issue of balance of power within an organization. And let me just take you to a point about the negotiations which happened to get Ramaphosa run as Deputy President of the party and of the country. So there was a lot of exchanges which took place to get him to the position of Deputy President of the ANC and Deputy President of the country. Whereas in the case of Mr. Zuma had a constituency and support right from his time in exile and up to the time when he was back in South Africa. Something which Mr. Ramaphosa did not enjoy, because Ramaphosa's roots in the ANC are shallow compared to Mr. Zuma. Yes.
Prof, I want to just ask you about, the issue of the deployment committee. It featured quite greatly yesterday in the first day of the President's testimony at the State Capture Inquiry. And just before we went to lunch, Advocate Paul Pretorius again bringing up the issue of the deployment committee insofar as it relates to the JSC appointments. In fact, Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo saying he got the impression that the deployment committee didn't deal with the issue of judges, and he was quite surprised to hear it had happened.
Yes, the first thing I think we need to note is that the ANC's deployment policy is very wobbly. It is not based, it's not grounded on principle. I have argued this. I remember one time when the national chairperson of the ANC, Mr. Mantashe, was the Secretary General at that time. He came to UJ, and I happened to be on the platform with him. And one of the issues I underlined was that even though deployment is done, even by the Chinese, the Americans, many other countries, they do deployment, but a set of core principles which guide your deployment. You deploy in this area, you don't deploy in this area. In other words, the boundaries of policy. It's something you don't find when you look into the ANC's deployment policy. And I think it's one area the ANC needs to look into. If at all they are still going to have a policy conference. This is one issue which is very important going forward.
Sure. And I think still on the issue of deployment, but also I would say appointments, say of cabinet, and also various strategic areas of the economy. Now, we have an ANC here that seems to have this sense of deference to the leader. We hear the president talking here and saying that they were blindsided, and one person spoke out, which is Fikile Mbalula, in 2011 against the Guptas, and all of them were aware of what was happening. But he did not act because he feared being fired. Jacob Zuma may not be here today, but that culture, I would argue, that is a culture that remains within the ANC. What would it take to change that culture?
Sbu, that is a very difficult question. I say it's very difficult because, you see, if you look at the leadership posture of President Ramaphosa, he's a kind of person who comes across in such a way that his opponents can actually be emboldened rather than start fearing him. And I think it has to do with his style. He's too much of a gentleman. And I'm not sure whether the ANC, in the crisis moment in which it is, a gentleman of a leader is the one who can actually keep the house in order very quickly. He's very strategic. He takes time, and he chooses words, you see. And the kind of chaos you find in the ANC now, I think it does need a leader who's a bit aggressive, who can go out of the norm and impose certain things. And unfortunately, that's not the personality, that's not the approach you can find with Mr. Ramaphosa.
Shall we take a look at some of what the President had to say in that Q&A with Advocate Paul Pretorius now, admitting again, and I think we heard this yesterday as well, Sbu, that the ANC knew as far back as 2011 when Fikile Mbalula said that he'd been told by one of the Gupta brothers, in fact, that he was going to be he was going to be sports minister, I believe it was, Sbu?
I think it was
2011, the President admitting the ANC was aware, it was made aware of the Guptas and its influence in 2011, and that there was no immediate action. He also talks about the Waterkloof landing. Let's take a listen to that.
I think we were blindsided by the fact that this family were friends to the ultimate leader of our party, and that blindsided us. But there were occasions, for instance, when Mbalula mentioned it in the NEC, yes, there was no immediate action, but he was brave enough to raise it. And that level of alertness was just not there. And when I had the occasion, when the Gupta brothers came to the ANC headquarters to discuss this and other matters with us, I was one who specifically raised this and said, this should never have happened, and it put our president, who is your friend, in great difficulties. So, answering your question, was it enough? No, it was not enough.
Now, Prof, listening to the president saying that they were blindsided during that time, and Balula had spoken out, and we hear time and again, I think you've said it yourself, that of the type of leadership that the president embodies. But more importantly, it's about what he says he's trying to do, which is to rebuild. But the one crucial question would be, if you still have someone like a David Mahlobo, as was asked here earlier, and Arthur Fraser in a strategic position, how do you rebuild effectively with people who had intended to bring down the house?
So all it shows is that the balance of power within the party is still not completely in his favor. Remember, there's a conference which is coming, and there is local government elections to come. The performance of the party is always first seen as a reflection of the top leader, the president. So he is walking very thin ground, trying to balance things, keeping the rotten sometimes within his leadership, because once these rotten potatoes unite, he's not sure if he could be able to control the situation. So he's trying to play a very, very difficult game, because there is, I mean, the amount of evidence against Mr. Mahlobo is just lots and lots. And you'd have expected a firm president to directly confront him and act on it. But it's not happening. Should we say it's the weaknesses of his style? Perhaps. Because he argues that let's wait for the final report to come out. And then when it is out, he will decide, informed by the report, what to do with the two, Arthur Fraser and Mr. Mahlobo.
Yeah. The issue of the State Security Agency featuring heavily in the Q&A session today.